What if Modulo Yuji trained Gojo, not to make him stronger, but to turn the strongest sorcerer into someone completely different? Yuji traveled decades into the past, arriving shortly after Satoru Gojo's battle against Toji Fushiguro. For Gojo, becoming the strongest was enough to protect everyone around him. But Yuji already knew how that story ended. He made a single decision. This time, Gojo wouldn't walk the same path alone. Gojo's training would begin. The real problem wasn't his strength, it was the way he relied on it. From the very first day, Yuji forced Gojo into situations where overwhelming power solved nothing. Instead of winning through infinity alone, he had to analyze his opponents, predict their next move, and think several steps ahead before every attack. As the weeks turned into months, Gojo's fighting style slowly began to change. He stopped treating battles as tests of power and started viewing them as problems waiting to be solved. Every movement became more calculated, every decision more deliberate, and every victory required less effort than before. Gojo was no longer training to become the strongest sorcerer alive. He was learning how to become the one person capable of changing the future itself. That transformation would soon become obvious to everyone around him. But changing the way Gojo fought was only the beginning. Before meeting Modulo Yuji, he believed carrying every burden alone was simply the price of being the strongest. But after years of training, that mindset slowly disappeared. Instead of solving every mission by himself, Gojo began trusting other sorcerers with responsibilities they would have never received before. He encouraged teamwork, shared his knowledge freely, and focused on helping others grow rather than proving his own superiority. That philosophy eventually transformed Jujutsu High itself. Young sorcerers were no longer raised to fight in the shadow of the strongest. They were taught to think independently, rely on one another, and develop their own strengths from the very beginning. Without realizing it, Gojo had achieved something his overwhelming power never could. He wasn't creating stronger followers, he was creating future leaders. And over the next decade, those lessons would shape an entirely new generation of sorcerers, unlike anything the Jujutsu world had ever seen. Gojo was no longer the only pillar holding up Jujutsu Society. Inspired by everything he had learned, he dedicated his career to building the next generation, instead of carrying every responsibility alone. Megumi mastered the 10 Shadows technique years earlier than expected, unlocking abilities that once seemed impossible. Yuta learned to control his immense cursed energy with far greater efficiency. Instead of depending on one invincible sorcerer, Jujutsu Society now possessed an entire generation capable of standing beside Gojo. For the first time in history, the balance of power had completely shifted. But while the sorcerers had grown stronger than ever, someone else had been watching those changes from the shadows. Kenjaku quickly realized that the future he had spent centuries preparing for was beginning to slip beyond his control. When the Shibuya incident finally began, Kenjaku believed every piece of his plan was still in place. By sealing Gojo away, the prison realm gave Kenjaku the opportunity to set everything else into motion. But this time, Gojo had already been preparing for that moment for years. Yuji's training had taught him to question every unexpected opportunity and every perfectly timed encounter. Instead of charging into Shibuya alone, Gojo coordinated with the strongest sorcerers around him, forcing the enemy to reveal their strategy far earlier than expected. The prison realm was activated, but it never had the chance to seal him. For the first time in centuries, Kenjaku's perfect plan had completely failed. And with his greatest weapon rendered useless, he was left with only one option: to create an entirely new future. For the first time in 1,000 years, Kenjaku was forced to abandon a plan he had spent centuries perfecting. Without Gojo sealed inside the prison realm, every calculation collapsed. The balance of power had shifted too far in the sorcerer's favor. But Kenjaku had never survived this long without adapting. Instead of trying to remove Gojo, he chose to remove everything Gojo had built. Rather than targeting the strongest sorcerer, he launched coordinated attacks across Japan, forcing the new generation of sorcerers to fight on multiple fronts at once. His goal was simple: separate them, overwhelm them, and prove that even united, they could still be broken. What he didn't anticipate was how different this generation had become. They didn't wait for Gojo to save them. They fought as one, forcing Kenjaku to step onto the battlefield himself. And for the first time since beginning his centuries-long plan, victory was no longer within his control. With Kenjaku forced into open battle, his greatest advantage disappeared. There were no more hidden schemes, no carefully prepared traps, and no single sorcerer left to isolate. Gojo led the battlefield, but he was no longer fighting alone. Megumi's mastery of the 10 Shadows, Yuta's refined control over Rika, Yuji's relentless determination, and every lesson Gojo had passed on combined into a force that even Kenjaku had never predicted. His centuries of planning had all been built around one assumption, that history would always repeat itself. This time, it didn't. Without Gojo ever being sealed, Sukuna never gained the same overwhelming advantage, and Kenjaku's vision of a new world collapsed before it could take shape. In the end, Modulo Yuji achieved something no amount of strength alone could have accomplished. He didn't change the future by defeating a stronger enemy. He changed it by ensuring the world would never have to depend on a single hero again. And that one decision rewrote the fate of Jujutsu Kaisen forever. But this wasn't the only timeline Modulo Yuji changed. There's another story waiting for you.